This video will help us learn how to form theological observations, how to express concise central idea statements, and how to derive applications from the text we're studying. Let's begin with a brief review of our exegetical steps. There are 4 major steps, and they break down as follows. We began by learning to determine the reasonable boundaries of a passage. Then we moved to observation, asking, what does the text say? We want to begin by determining the genre, whether narrative or poetry, and then forming observations appropriate to that genre. That particularly pertains to literary devices. We also practiced making historical observations. After boundaries and these basic observations, then we're in a position to responsibly interpret the passage, asking not what does it say, but now what does it mean? Here we grouped portions of the passage together using logical outlining to try and get a sense of the flow of thought as it moves from beginning to end. And then interpretive questions, seeking to listen to the passage closely enough that we can imagine it as if it were a person saying, if only you would ask this question, you'll be surprised how much I have to disclose. So we seek to discern those questions that kind of break open the passage like a geode. From this preparation, then, we move forward to distilling theological information, and this we'll call theological observation. Then formulating the central idea of the text and moving on to the last step, which is application. Here we ask, what does this passage mean to me? Not just what does it say in an abstract sense, but what does it mean to me? Let's take up then formulating theological observations. It's true we're in the interpretive phase, and yet here we find ourselves making observations. This is to set us at ease, realizing that this particular skill is a fairly basic one, but we've purposely withheld it until this point. We didn't want to jump to theological observations back when we were in the process of historical observations and seeing literary devices. But now we're in a good position to form theological observations. Instructors that taught me at this level made the whole prospect of forming theological observations fairly simple and took away the sense of intimidation when they said, learn to ask 3 questions of a passage. What does it tell us about God? What does it tell us about humankind? And then, what does it tell us about how God and humankind interact? Admittedly, sometimes the information about points 1 and 2 will automatically bleed into interaction. But if they don't, then we'll want to move on to number 3 and see if there's information provided there. Notice that we are limiting ourselves to what this passage says about God, humankind, and their interaction. By very definition, we will not be asking for a comprehensive teaching about the nature of God or a comprehensive teaching about humankind. We're simply sitting with this text and asking it, if you were the only text that I had before me, what would be my picture of God? If you were the only text I had access to, what would be my picture of the nature of humankind? Let's begin by practicing with a familiar passage, John 3:16. Pause the video at this point and formulate your proposal concerning what this passage says about God, about humankind, and about their interaction. All right, I wish I could see what you have. Perhaps concerning God, you would have simply written down, God loves the world. That is staggering. You would find that this passage tells us an activity that God engaged in is releasing his Son. And that he did for the purpose of providing a way out of death for humankind. This starts to get into interaction, doesn't it? This passage concerning humankind tells us that, left on our own, we're destined to perish. But in addition, the good news, all people are candidates for eternal life. Everyone who believes in him. Interaction? It seems that this passage is telling us that God hopes people will put their trust in his Son, Jesus. And that's not a light matter, but a desperate need of ours. The next slide will let us consider another passage we've looked at earlier in this course. Do you remember Psalm 114? Take a moment, let's read it over, and then the next slide will encourage you to experiment with the same three categories. So let's read it. When Israel went out from Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, Judah became God's sanctuary, Israel his dominion. The sea looked and fled, Jordan turned back, the mountains skipped like rams, the hills like lambs. Why is it, O sea, that you flee? O Jordan, that you turn back? O mountains, that you skip like rams? O hills, like lambs? Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, who turns the rock into a pool of water, the flint into a spring of water. Once again, look over this passage, please, and jot down in three categories. What does it say concerning God, humankind, and their interaction? Pause the video and restart it after you've written down something in each category. I wish I could see what you'd written down. I have a hunch it may look something like this. Concerning God, he's presented as one who brought miraculous deliverance in times past for his people. He is one who, when he arrives in a territory, in a region, has an upsetting effect on nature, hills, waters. It's appropriate to respond to him with profound reverence. And then there's this sense that he keeps on providing in miraculous ways, not simply something in the past. How about humankind? The messages about him making his sanctuary with a group of people, the Israelites with Judah, suggest that people do not need to live isolated from God. Also, the fact that we have this directive, tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, suggests that humans, as members of the earth, are capable of experiencing awe. On the other hand, the fact that they need to be urged to tremble suggests that they're capable of responding with indifference. I wonder what else you added. How does God and humankind interact? Perhaps you jotted down this realization that God can dwell among his people. And that as Israel reflects on what brought them to this point, they will recall a history of benefiting from divine rescue. And finally, that humans, when they are in their right mind, should deeply revere God, not simply because of his power, but because of his loving care. Please note, these bullets that you see are not exhaustive. In showing you what occurred to my mind, there's not a sense of saying either you got it like mine and consequently would be correct, or you did it differently and would be incorrect. This is just these are simply the ones that impressed me, and hopefully it gives you an example of how to look at a passage through these lenses and as a result come away with its theology, what it teaches about God, humankind, and their interaction. Now let's consider this step called formulating the central idea of the text. Sometimes we abbreviate this the CIT. Others call this the central thrust of the text. What we're attempting to do at this point is compress what we've learned about the passage's core message, compress it into a concise statement. Part of our aim is that it would be no longer than a single sentence. Now you may be thinking to yourself, how can I possibly compress all those ideas, for example, from Psalm 114 into one sentence? Well, the truth is you can't compress all of them. That's the meaning of the particular word, the central idea of the text. If you thought of the passage topographically as having some foothills and then a major mountain peak and then some other foothills and maybe some valleys, by concentrating on the central idea of the text, it means that we would have studied the topography enough, that is to say the message, and helpful in this regard is doing a logical outline, where that helps us to distinguish between a major mountain peak and the foothills. So the central idea of the text will concentrate on that major mountain peak. How do we know what's the major mountain peak? Well, by listening enough to the passage that we can see what are the primary points and what are the supportive or secondary points. And again, the process of a logical outline is really foundational in arriving at the central idea of a text. So besides limiting the CIT to a single sentence, we want to express it in such a way that it no longer has the particularities of persons or places that color the original passage. If, for example, we were doing something on the Ten Commandments in, say, Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5, two places where it's presented, but consider Exodus 20. There we have the setting of Mount Sinai, Moses being invited by God to come up the mountain, adjust himself, and receive God's particular stipulations of how God's people are to behave, Ten Commandments. If we were to do the CIT from that passage, that CIT would not contain things like Mount Sinai, that would not be named. The individual Moses would not be named. Rather, we want to get at the concept, the core teaching, which is God delivering instructions because of his love for the people to show them how they may dwell with him at his invitation. So we want it to be timeless. Why? Because we want to be able to, in a sense, teleport it into the modern era. We want to be able to lift it out of its original surroundings. And when we reduce it to a principle or to a timeless teaching, we're able to lift it out of its original settings and then reapply it to our modern setting. It's tempting as we move to this level to jump the gun and begin inserting commands, imperatives, statements of should or ought, or use of first person and second person, we or I or you, kind of pointing the finger. There will be a time for that. It'll be in the application. But it's a useful discipline at this point, not only to keep it timeless, but keep it on the kind of the concept or principle level without pointing fingers yet. In other words, refrain from using imperatives. So the first bullet below there gives us a good example, one that is descriptive. Followers of Christ will not pursue personal recognition. We haven't given any scriptural background for this. Perhaps it's a passage from Jeremiah. Offhand, I don't recall exactly which chapter. Would it be perhaps 45? I'd have to double check. A particular chapter where God speaks to a particular individual in that scenario and says, are you seeking great things for yourself? Don't seek them. Okay, don't pursue something great for yourself like personal recognition. So from that, we might extract the principle that followers of Christ, or in that case, Christ's not named, so we might just say God generally. Someone following God will not pursue personal recognition. That's descriptive. What we want to refrain from doing then is in the negative bullet that follows, not to be prescriptive, giving a prescription for people to fulfill. An example we should not use then is, we should not seek personal advancement. Notice that has the first person, we, and then the obligation, should not. Refrain from that. There'll be a time for that, but not yet. Here's an example of a CIT then from Psalm 114. It seemed to me that reverence is what that poet is really impressed with, the importance of reverence. So reverence is a reasonable response when God is near, since he has rescued his people in the past and will supply their needs in the future. That's descriptive. It's not pointing fingers, it's just stating something that is recommended. We want to refrain from a prescriptive CIT, so we want to omit any imperatives. We want to omit first or second person, that is the I or we statements or the you statements. We do not want to do it as follows in the quotes. Since the Creator wishes to be near us, we must revere him. That's going a step beyond the CIT. Refrain from that if you can. Let's go back to John 3:16, for God so loved the world. And would you practice formulating a CIT? Pause the video at this point and just pencil something out. All right, I wonder how yours came out. Did it sound anything like this? Remember, we want it to be descriptive. God has created an escape route for humans otherwise doomed to perish. So we have the activity of God, what it is he did, who it benefits, and what's their need. Now what we want to refrain from is jumping the gun and moving ahead to commands, imperatives, a prescription, which might sound this way. You should trust God's Son, so you will not perish. Now that's a great expression, but again, it's moving a little bit beyond the level of the CIT where we want to just describe it and have this principle or concept rather than putting the teeth into it of a command.